The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother and killed him. In the book of Genesis, Cain's character worked to reaffirm mankind's disposition for sin. As one of the most well-known betrayals, the story of Cain and Abel has been remade and adapted to literature and film. 20th Century Fox produced a literal interpretation of Cain and Abel's story in The Bible in the Beginning. In 2009, the Jack Black comedy Year One parodied the story along with the history of humanity. And in literature, many are familiar with John Steinbeck's electrifying allusion to Cain and Abel in his magnum opus, East of Eden. So, with all of its influence elsewhere, it's no surprise that the biblical influence of Cain and Abel has permeated to inspire video games. On this episode of Antagonist Archives, we will explore the origin of Cain, the lone dragoon from Final Fantasy IV. But before we begin, I want to make it clear that spoilers for Final Fantasy IV are ahead. And although the game is over 20 years old, the delivery of its plot is so memorable that I would strongly recommend playing the game first. The choice of Cain for Antagonist Archives may come as weird to some players. He isn't an evil mastermind like Kefka or Ganon, the other two villains we've covered. But I still think that his anti-hero characteristics represent a far more interesting and risky choice that the developers had to take. Aside from his name, which is just Cain with a K instead of a C, Cain's behavior as Baron's leading dragoon follows the story of the biblical Cain quite closely. At the start of the game, Cain is an outcast with an overwhelming dedication to the dragoon lifestyle, but his dialogue reveals a deeper insecurity. In his first scene, Cain feels the need to justify and qualify his inferiority to Cecil, leading us to believe that despite his dedication, he lacks confidence. Think of the person who insists that they love their job, or the student who constantly wants to talk about test scores and grades. Bringing up a weakness is a common tell that you are just trying to justify an inferiority in your head. Better yet, picture this. A student exits graduate school with a degree in a field that gets horrible pay. They were told to chase their dreams as a kid, but now that they have done just that, they find themselves $50,000 in debt with no job offers and friends that have surpassed them in every regard. Imagine how devastated you would feel if this happened to you. Would you turn to betrayal or crime? Because dragoons are, according to the lore, objectively weaker than Dark Knights, but Cain still feels obligated to become a bona fide dragoon. Comparing the story to the Bible, we can liken Cain's dragoon father to a sort of divine god figure that Cain wants to impress. Just as Cain from the Bible made an offering to God, Cain from FF4 dedicates his life to following his father's footsteps as a dragoon. And in true biblical fashion, Cain with a K gets punished for it. He is secondary to Cecil, just as Cain in the Bible was second to Abel in the eyes of God. Not only does Cecil steal Cain's love, Rosa, but he is also blessed with a divine cleansing when he becomes a paladin. Similarly, Abel is rewarded with the divine generosity of God, while Cain's offering is ignored. Both Cain and Cain are traitors, betraying their friends in order to satiate their insecurities. In short, Final Fantasy IV presents a series of lucky events for Cecil and an utter lack of luck for Cain. So it's no surprise that he betrays Cecil, but it's not because he's evil. He betrays Cecil because he's in a vulnerable state of jealousy, a jealousy that is eventually capitalized on by the game's villain, Golbez. I don't think the biblical influence of Cain on Cain was meant to be hidden in any way. It's actually pretty obvious. And for this reason, some people argue that Cain's adherence to the story of biblical Cain was lazy on the part of the developers. But I would actually argue that their ability to weave the themes of the Bible into their originally developed world was actually an extremely difficult thing to pull off. On top of that, many of these classic biblical stories are endearing because of their relatability, and by fusing magic moogles and chocobos with sensitive topics explored in Genesis, Final Fantasy IV created one of the most highly developed anti-heroes in the FF canon. Of course, if I stopped the discussion right here, I feel like I'd be doing a huge disservice to the writers of the game. So let's explore another possibility that spearheaded Kain's creation. One of the central themes in Final Fantasy IV is internal cleansing. The main character, Cecil, as we mentioned before, washes away his sins in order to transform into a paladin, having to battle inner demons in the process. It's a powerful moment in Final Fantasy IV, and perhaps one of the most iconic scenes in gaming history. But ignoring the sequels, Kain never undergoes a similar ceremonial transformation. Instead, he is forced to tax every resource of his willpower simply to do the right thing in the end. In Fyodor Dostoevsky's 600-page endeavor, Crime and Punishment, he sets up the main character, Raskolnikov, to be a heartless murderer. Yet, upon realizing that he is not the Napoleonic male he aspired to be, Raskolnikov crumbles under the guilt of his crimes. In this story, the punishment for the crime is not prison. The punishment is actually Raskolnikov's disappointment after he realizes that he isn't special. Kain, after being taken away and brainwashed by Golbez, becomes a heartless warrior who tramples over innocents to achieve power. But even Kain, a trained Dragoon Lancer, can't handle the pressure of ruthlessness. He concedes, rejoining Cecil's party just as Raskolnikov turned himself in at the end of Crime and Punishment. The crime and punishment connection I'm making here may seem like a stretch, but in the Kefka episode, we learned that Final Fantasy developers are completely open to using literature in their stories, and in my opinion, Kain is no exception. And although I didn't enjoy Crime and Punishment as much as I hoped, I still see a strong resemblance between Kain and Raskolnikov, two of the most famous anti-heroes. Based on his personality in Final Fantasy IV, other games like Dissidia have taken interesting liberties with Kain's design. In Dissidia, as well as in the Final Fantasy IV DS remake, Kain is shown to be bigger and bulkier than Cecil. He exudes an aura of strength and arrogance, just as he did on the Super Nintendo. In Dissidia, his voice actor, Liam O'Brien, captures Kain's personality perfectly, with his snarky and conceited voice lines. But as Dissidia's story unfolds, we are slowly shown to the more vulnerable side of Kain, that seeks attention and cannot handle the immense responsibility of betrayal. Looking back at all the information we covered, I don't think there was ever an argument on whether or not Kain was a good character. At this point, his character is so well known in the JRPG community that it's hard not to recognize his impact. But I feel like most people are neglecting why he is so influential. He perfectly captures the human tendency towards jealousy and regret. He reminds us of the feeling of utter humiliation when we work so hard for a college degree, job application, or SAT score and are defeated so effortlessly by some rival. He reminds us of the frustration we experience when we are blown out of the water by someone else's talent after working so hard to be the best. He reminds us of the desperation that can turn us to crime and betrayal when we believe all else is lost. But most importantly, Kain reminds the players that even when you've dug yourself into the deepest hole, there is still hope for redemption. Final Fantasy IV pioneered storytelling techniques in gaming, and I am often baffled by how little appreciation the game itself gets for pulling this off. Without Final Fantasy IV, developers would not be budgeting for scenario mapping and scripting, and the epic stories of Mass Effect and Halo would be considered secondary to the importance of gameplay. Some people, of course, may agree that gameplay is the most important aspect of a game, but there is an entire population of gamers that prefer story over gameplay, and without Final Fantasy IV's release, their involvement in the gaming industry would have been totally negligible. And at the forefront of Final Fantasy IV's jaw-dropping story is Kain Highwind, the conflicted dragoon whose character development started a new era in RPGs and gaming as we know it.